Okay, great. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Adam.
Great to meet you. I saw what she said at the Montclair Film Festival, and I saw you. You did the Q&A, but I was going to introduce myself and immediately invite you on, but you were whisked off somewhere by maybe
Okay.
second, third generation Paulettes or something. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe.
Before we get started, of course, this is a documentary that you directed about the life and career of the film critic Pauline Kael. What has been the response by critics that you've talked to?
Well, I haven't talked to very many critics,
Oh,
to be honest. I mean, a lot of critics have written about the film, um,
okay.
but and there are some critics in my film, and the critics that knew Pauline, they've told me that well, they told me that they thought I got her, which was really nice to hear because I never met Pauline myself, and my introduction to her was as a college student in the '80s, and I loved her writing, and
Hmm.
that was the spark in making this movie. But I didn't know her personally, so to hear that from somebody else who did know her was great to hear.
I bet. So how did you gauge that just from the sheer amount of content that you either watched or that you read? You got a sense of who she was and went with that?
Yeah, I mean, it was just attrition, really. It took me a long time to make this movie. It took me 4.5 years. So I started out by reading her books and going back over some of her great essays, a lot of which I hadn't read uh, because she wasn't just a critic. She wrote, especially early in her career, she wrote a lot of essays on different aspects of movies. And I always tell people she really wasn't a film critic. She was a writer whose subject was the movies.
Mm.
And you know, th- that's she started out with this great ambition to be a writer, and she didn't really know what kind of writer she wanted to be, but she tried playwriting and failed. She wrote political essays when she was in college and just after college, and she really didn't get anywhere with the things that she had tried until she started writing about movies and film criticism, and by that point she was already in her 30s, and one of the things I found out just in making this movie was how well read she was in her teens and 20s. She was just a voracious reader, and
Mm.
she read the great authors and poets, like, and not just one of their books, but their whole canon. And so by the time she started writing about movies, she had that foundation, and it was, I think, unique amongst film critics, and I think it explains partly, anyway, why she was so powerful and so strident in what she wrote, because maybe strident's a bad word, but she knew where the movies came from. She knew the stories of literature, and that formed the basis for what she wrote about. And I think it also explains the sense of fun that she had, and the humor that she approached it with. And um, it was, movies were not uh, as serious as a book,
Right.
and movies couldn't go as deep as books do. Movies can do different things better, but she always looked for the fun of movies, and that's what made her so great to read.
Yeah, I think there's a section, I forget who was quoted, but where she also took into account the audience response, the film was contextual as well as in of itself.
Right, right. Yeah, she wrote about the audience, and that's a unique thing about Pauline. Also, is um, she was born in 1919, so she grew up as a child watching silent movies, and her career lasted until the early '90s, which was kind of the beginning of the digital age. So, her entire movie-going career was really just watching movies in the theater,
Mm.
and that was part of what she wrote about. She picked up on the audience. She picked up on how they were responding to it, and um, she listened to the murmurs, and she writes about that, and it's really it brings another light to film criticism.
When she started to indeed, write about film, I think her first major gig, if relatively speaking, was at McCall's. Is that?
That was her first. Yeah, she wrote her. She got her first book published in 1965, and that was a collection of her essays, and it was called "I Lost It at the Movies."
Which
And
I happen to have
after,
read. Glad to
yes,
say.
great book. And after that, she got invited to write for Life magazine, and so she did come, and she moved to New York with her daughter, and she started writing for Life, and she wrote this great piece on the making of the group. She observed Sidney Lumet
Hmm.
on the set of the group, and wrote a long piece about that. And Pauline always wrote long pieces, and they only wanted to publish about a third of it, and so she got frustrated with that. And then she was, yes, hired by McCall's. She wrote for Vogue. She wrote for some other magazines that are no longer published. But
Hmm.
McCall's was her first real steady gig, and that she got fired from because the editors didn't believe that she was in sync with America's taste.
I see. Yeah, that she had that problem until, of course, that became almost her signature. Was she was going to be a sole voice, and that was kind of why people thought she would stir up a certain amount of controversy just being who she was. But when she was starting off at Life and even up to the New Yorker, where she would ultimately spend the crux of her career. I mean, were there other women film critics or film writers? I know we all know Molly Haskell was a major voice, but was that later on? I mean, or was Pauline really a pioneer in that regard?
She was, but she wasn't the only one. Now, there was a critic called Judith
Oh
Christ,
yeah, sure.
um,
Was she
but
writing?
she
Hmm.
wrote. I forgot who she wrote. I think she wrote for TV Guide
Oh, okay. You may be right.
or the yeah, and Molly Haskell for sure. She's in my film.
Yes.
She wrote for The Voice, I believe, and but Pauline, she came from San Francisco, and the bigger kind of conflict was that Pauline was not only was she a woman, but she was coming from San Francisco, which was a much smaller market then, and kind of regarded as the sticks almost. And she was fighting against the New York critics, especially the New York Times, which had so much weight. And she often disagreed with the lead critic there was a gentleman named Bosley Crowther, and um, he eventually kind of missed the boat on Bonnie and Clyde, and lost his job at the Times in the late '60s. But and that was the film that kind of made Pauline's career, is that she wrote a huge long spec essay really on Bonnie and Clyde that was published in the New Yorker, and then a year later she got her job there.
There's no denying what makes her stand out is she was prescient and she believed in herself enough and loved movies enough to really spot something and completely put herself behind it and support it regardless of whether she again was in the minority or not. That it was the strength of her convictions, and she talks, and you have footage of her. There is quite a bit of footage of her, in fact, in the film, uh, where she talks about that. You have to have the courage to be unpopular and the courage to not, be in the club, part of the club, and be willing to take the risks.
Yeah, and her whole point was really develop your style enough so that you are good enough so that you can call your own shots. And she paid a lot of dues. She wrote for initially just some of the film publications like Sight and Sound, and I think maybe Film Comment and some others. But it was a narrow audience, and so when she got to the commercial magazines like Life and McCall's and the New Yorker, she'd already been through so much,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
she developed her style, and she had respect, and of course she had published her first book. But when she got to the New Yorker, William Shawn was the longtime editor there, and kind of a conservative gentleman, and they butted heads because she really wanted to write in her own way, and that way really wasn't the New Yorker style. It was Pauline's style, and
Right, 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 right.
Sean respected her enough to let her write, and he gave her really unlimited space, which was very unusual at that time.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, so what year was it when Andrew Sarris wrote his article on the auteur theory, and then she responded sometime later with an essay of her own called Circles and Squares, which was another, I guess, benchmark in her in her career.
Right.
This created this feud that everybody knows about.
Yeah, that was in '62 when Sarris wrote his essay called Notes on the Auteur Theory, and that was really kind of an echo of what the French were writing about, and the French included Truffaut and Godard when they were critics before they started making movies.
Hmm.
But they were really writing about the American studio directors, um, and Sarris picked up on that, and he wanted to make connections that any movie that Michael Curtiz made, for example,
Hmm.
what should be worthy of kind of the canon of his movies, and it was less about quality than about looking for consistent signature in movies.
Yeah.
And Pauline wrote her response. It was the next year. It was 1963 when she wrote Circles and Squares, and that essay was in her first book. But it was really saying, well, I just don't agree with this. It's not about the signature. It's about the quality of the work. And if Michael Curtiz makes a bad movie, it's a bad movie. It doesn't mean that it's good because it was made by one of the people you consider,
Yes.
uh, a substantial filmmaker. So,
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
it became a big kind of public thing over the years. But Pauline really didn't give much credence to it, and it was more the writers who were outside of Sarris and Kael. But Pauline was just she always thought she was right, and she believed she was right, and
Well, you have
she
to,
kind of
especially if you're
did her own thing.
yeah. Well, if you're let's say you are criticizing, you have to believe you are right, don't you?
I think
But
so.
it's
Sure.
your
Otherwise, you'd be wishy-washy, right? I
exactly, which
mean,
was
you'd
what really repelled her the most.
that really that. What did you say?
Oh, and that was what kind of, at least what I took away was that being wishy-washy, to use your expression, is what really repelled her the most.
Oh yeah, yeah. She always wanted to know, what you thought, and she was always, according to her friends, asking people, well, "What's good? What do you think?" And if you didn't have an opinion, what's wrong with you?
Hmm.
If you see a movie or read a book or do anything, you should have a point of view about it.
Were the Paulettes a thing when? I'm assuming Saris took this article, Circles and Squares, very personally, and maybe bristled at that, and then that sort of is maybe partly why it became this thing between them, this quote unquote feud, and then she had this gaggle of critic fans, right? That which were nicknamed the Paulettes. Now, is that this before that? Because we're talking about, as you just said, 1962, 1963. I seem to recall that the Paulettes kind of developed into a thing a little later than that, maybe in the 70s.
Yeah, it was after she got her job at the New
That
Yorker,
makes
and
more sense. Her platform would have been much bigger, yeah.
yeah, and as Paul Schrader says in my film, he started out as a critic, and he met Pauline right out of college, and she encouraged him to be a critic, and she got him a job, and she actually got him into UCLA. And a couple of years after that, he wrote a screenplay, and he stopped becoming a critic as he had success, and he wrote, I think, the Yakuza, and
Yes, he
then
and his
a couple,
brother, right?
yeah,
Hmm.
and then a couple years later, he wrote Taxi Driver, and so he and Pauline had a more complicated relationship. She really liked to mentor people and bring them along, but according to some people, she encouraged young critics to get behind a film that she liked, and I don't know how true that is. I mean, Schrader says that happened. I think it may have happened somewhat in early in her career, but um, for me, it's hard to believe that a young critic, no matter how young, is going to, write an opinion on a movie that he doesn't agree with just because this respected critic is telling them to do so. But
Mm. But in the film,
Schrader
the
does
film,
say that happened.
yeah. Well, in the film, I think it's brought to light that right, would, that she was actively creating a a little, I don't know, cadre or something. I'm not sure quite what to call these, these, what would, again, what we call would be called Paulettes, but that these critics that agreed with her to sort of create a force of some kind. I don't know. How would you how would you put it? Here's where I find her personality maybe to be, in a way, the most human too, because she liked to be the in this parental role. So her ego is clearly being fed here, but was she also trying to create enough of a position with her defenders, the other critics, where she would be in a very more powerful position? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not being very clear about it.
Well, no, I understand what you mean. I don't think she had a cabal. I think that's a good word. Is what it really would be if she had other critics going in lockstep with her opinion.
Yeah,
And
right.
you know, it, I mean, let's be real. We're talking about movies, and we're talking about small movies when this happened, if it happened. And she would see a movie like a Godard movie, like La Chinoise,
Hmm.
that Schrader notes in my movie. And you know, when that was released in the United States, it probably was released in a couple of theaters, or maybe 5 or 10 theaters at the most. And so Pauline's position was, well, this is a good film. This is doing something different. This should be recognized. This is so far away
I
from
see.
you know these Hollywood extravaganzas who don't need any help at all.
Right.
Let's give this one some help.
It's still the case, of course, and nothing's changed in that regard. This small film
Yeah,
barely, sometimes doesn't get reviewed anymore at all. So it's very true. So it was
right.
more what you feel was that she was just trying to draw some attention to films that otherwise might be ignored.
Oh,
Okay.
definitely. That was the only to me that was the only motivation. It wasn't about her getting her name out there. I mean, it might have been, but you know, she didn't do that for the bigger movies.
But internally within that group of people, including the Paul Schraders, if they turned against her, well, let me slightly change the way I'm saying it. If they decided to go their own way, would she then interpret that as going against her? And what did it become a kind of, a cult of personality in that way?
I think maybe so. Yeah, I mean, there's a writer in my film named Jaime Manrique who was a friend of Pauline's, and he says, if you did not like the movie she liked,
Yeah.
you could not be her friend.
Hmm. Hmm.
So she took movies very seriously, and I think she said at one point she believed that you could not be in a relationship with somebody
Right.
if you didn't have the same tastes in movies and other things.
There's a lot of truth to that. It's hard to, very few people can pull that off, successfully,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. Well, there are people like uh, Kelly Conaway and her husband George, right?
Oh well, that's the most extreme example. That's true, but I don't know. There's
How does
something
that work?
that is
Yeah,
the. There's your next documentary, Rob.
yeah,
Somebody's making that film. We all thought 20 years ago that James Carville and Mary
Mary Madeline.
Matlin, yeah, that was very unusual. How, but by contrast, I mean by comparison, it's easy to see how they would have pulled that off compared to this marriage.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking to Rob Garver, who is the director of What She Said: The Art of Pauline Kael. I like that you wrote the art of Pauline Kael. You could have chosen to say the writing or the the criticism, but you chose to use the words or the word art.
Yeah, I mean, it really is the art, and Pauline wrote about that. Actually, she wrote, if a critic is good, and he puts all of himself into it, he can be an artist, and but it's not for them to decide; it's for other people to decide, right? And if you read her first book, or even or her first three books, especially, they're just so multifaceted and insightful and witty and funny, and sometimes rude, but always thoughtful. And
Hmm.
often what she wrote was much better than the movie itself. So I think the title is well deserved.
Well, I think she herself says, and it's in the film, she goes, criticism is not a science, it's an art, right?
I don't know if I have that particular quote, but
Yeah, it isn't.
uh,
You should.
something close to it, maybe. Yeah.
I think so. But anyway, I was catching up. I also look because I'm so, Orson Welles crowbars his way into almost every episode of my podcast. He's been dead for about 35 years or something, but he still manages to pop up, as he, I'm sure, does in any film-related thing. Major benchmark in her career was the essay on Citizen Kane. Now, I just finished the Mankiewicz brothers book. I don't know, and I had the author on. Or have you had a chance to read that yet? I know your film is
Oh no, I've heard of it
okay.
though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a really entertaining read. I want to tell you, it's of course about Herman and Joe. They're both so funny and clever. So this author really gets the spirit of those brothers. But there is a large portion in that book dedicated to the controversy between Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles, and who ultimately wrote Citizen Kane, and how much credit should go to whom. And what comes out essentially is that what was it, the studio RKO, I guess,
Right.
they commissioned Herman to write the book, but they owned the screenplay, so, or the property. So basically Orson Welles' contract was that he was going to be this quadruple threat, and that he would essentially get the credit for the entire picture, and Herman would be sort of behind the scenes. So, but it wasn't until, and I'm going through all this and hogging the show for a moment, only to get your response to what I'm about to say, and that is that Herman didn't himself bristle until Orson Welles went out of his way publicly to take credit for the screenplay in its entirety, that Herman started to make some, noise and push back. That was the way I interpreted it. He might have stayed quiet until then, if Orson didn't go out of his way to take the spotlight for writing the film, and entirely.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's hard. I've read a lot of the material too, and
Okay.
it's hard to determine what's somebody's story or somebody's bad memory and the truth. But if you look at the film, it did wind up with Herman Mankiewicz first in the screenplay credit,
Hmm.
and from what I found out, Pauline Kael's archives are at the Lilly Library in Indiana. It's the same place where
Yes.
Orson Welles' archives
Mm.
are. And so while I was there, I went into his archives a little bit, and they have I think several versions of the script of Citizen Kane. And of course, most people know the first version of the script was written solely by Herman Mankiewicz, and it was called America. And I looked at that script, and there is everything is there. I mean, obviously, it was written by Welles as well in the end, and
Right. Sure.
Welles
Of
made the
course. This
film.
is his film,
But
no doubt.
but you know, as I show in the film, Mankiewicz worked for a Hearst newspaper. He knew people in Hearst circle, and the whole seed of the idea for Citizen Kane, I believe, was Herman Mankiewicz, and I think Wells kind of made it his own as they went along, and it was a great partnership. But I think what nobody disputes is that Herman Mankiewicz wrote the first several drafts by himself.
Right. Okay. So all this to say that lead to the point that Pauline wrote an article in February of 1971 called "Raising Cain," which was this sprawling two-part essay. Two parts meaning that it was in two parts in the
Two
different
issues.
two issues of the New Yorker, and caused a lot of controversy again.
Right.
and which I can't say I've finished reading yet, but I wish I had finished reading by now. But I got this, obviously, the the gist.
Yeah, it's a great essay because she makes the case
Yeah.
for Mankiewicz, and she also goes back into the. It's not just about that, but it's about the whole era that Herman Mankiewicz came out of, the 20s and the 30s, being a reporter,
Mm-hmm.
and she also writes about movies, about
Mm-hmm.
about newspaper writers like His Girl Friday and others. And it's a fascinating essay. I mean, even today you can read it and it's fresh. I mean,
Yeah.
when she wrote about Citizen Kane, it was already 30 years after the movie.
Right.
So
But it was always like number one on the AFI list, and it was still this iconic film. And so her idea was maybe to put it again in a more fresh context.
yeah, and to give credit where credit was due. I
Ultimately,
mean, I
yeah.
think maybe Pauline wanted to make a name for herself somewhat, but she backs it up. You read the essay, she makes her points, and maybe some of the things that she quotes aren't true. Peter Bogdanovich really heavily disagreed with what she wrote, and and other people do too. But I came away from that believing that the credit is accurate in the movie, and for me, Herman Mankiewicz was probably the primary force in the screenplay.
Yes, I agree with that. And again, I'm going to recommend you pick up that book after your theatricals, or
Yeah,
you're on the
it
other
sounds
side of
good.
that, because I think you really enjoyed the book, as I know I did. And well, this film, it's called What She Said: The Art of Pauline Kael, is currently screening at the New Art in L.A. and is going to be premiering theatrically at Film Forum in New York City on December 25th. So open the gifts with the kids and then take them to see. Now, did you get a chance to read everything that's published out there that's currently available and in print?
By Pauline?
Yeah,
Oh, sure.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I've got the first thing I did was get all her books. So,
right. Well, you said you read a
um,
lot of them already. You read a lot before that. You discovered her in the 80s, you said, I think.
yeah, but I read her
Hmm.
in the New Yorker
I
mostly.
see. Right, that makes sense. Hmm.
Yeah, I believe I did read Raising Cain in college as well, but I didn't read a lot of her until I started making this movie. So, but I think her first like 5 or 6 books are the best, all up until kind of the early '80s, and she writes about so many of the great films of that era. But yeah, that was the first step, is really to immerse myself in what she wrote.
I mean, she brought her back to life, as I think I started to say at the beginning of our conversation. It was really fun to see the film. My hat is off to you for that. I mean, it's
Thank
yeah.
you.
Anybody who loves film needs to see this documentary, because what comes out, obviously, other than her daughter Gina, the movies was her, definitely a child to her. She had that kind of fiercely passionate love for the movies.
Yeah.
She ultimately got Parkinson's. Which she lived with for some time, and then she passed away on September 3rd, 2001. Only, of course, about a week before 9/11. Turns out, so she
Right.
never lived through that experience. So, but she lived quite the ripe old age, regardless of the Parkinson's.
Yeah.
You know.
She lived to 80, 81, 82, I
Hmm.
believe, and yeah, she retired in '91, and she'd already had Parkinson's for I
Wow.
think 10 years, because I
Yeah.
I can see in some of her early interviews, um, she is quivering a little bit in some of those, and I think she had it from maybe in her early 60s, but her mind was sharp right until the end. I mean, people have told me stories like on her deathbed she was just kind of biting and witty, and
Mm,
so uh,
yeah.
so that was kind of a blessing, I think, for her.
Yeah, you have, of course, talking heads in the film. We should mention that because that's always fun to for people to know about. We mentioned Molly Haskell,
Yep.
and her daughter Gina is in it and participates. And there's a lot of very notable. And you mentioned Paul Schrader, of course. We should mention, of course, Quentin Tarantino, a rather obscure director, who I'm sure was only too happy. Was that an easy one to get, or was that challenging to get him, or how did?
Well, when I approached him, he was shooting The Hateful Eight, and he was
Wow.
not available. But when he finished, um, he was happy to interview. Yeah, I knew he would be. I thought he would be because he'd said in
It's
other
on the
interviews
record.
that
Yeah.
Pauline was his film school, and yeah, he was really enthusiastic, and David O. Russell as well, and they were like me. They read her as a kid, and she inspired them, I think. And then I have people like Francis Ford Coppola and John Borman and Paul Schrader who were all reviewed by her, and had some stories to tell, and then I wanted people from other aspects of the culture too. So I have Camille Paglia, who's great on Pauline as a writer, kind of in the vein of Dorothy Parker,
Hmm.
and then John Guare and Christopher Durang, who are playwrights.
Grail
Um,
Marcus, I love seeing him.
Grail Marcus, who writes about music. Yeah, and Grail is great. He's kind of the soul of the movie,
Hmm.
and then people like Craig Seligman, and Dan Menaker, who worked at the New Yorker with Pauline, so they had that point of view.
Sure. Who's
Um,
somebody, just one name, who you were, for whatever reason, couldn't get or just wasn't available that you were disappointed about?
um, Woody Allen and Warren Beatty.
Never
Yeah,
heard of
and they
them,
were both
but
they're both key figures
very
in
true.
her career, but they didn't want to talk to me.
I see. Interesting. I'm
Yeah.
surprised, at least by Warren Beatty. Seemed like he would have been.
No,
Hmm.
I don't. I don't think. Well, there's a woman in my movie named Lily Analik, and she writes for Vanity Fair, and she wrote a piece on Pauline's time in Hollywood. Pauline went to Hollywood, gave up her job at the New Yorker, and worked for Warren
Yep.
Beatty for about 6 months. And it didn't work out. It was kind of a disaster, and there's conflicting opinions about what really
I
happened.
see.
Either she was fired or she quit, but
Right.
um,
Did
I
she
don't
jump or
think
was she
I don't.
pushed?
Yeah,
Well, anybody who has a career worth, and who reaches for the top or reaches and is ambitious has to have some experience like that in their career. I mean, it's impossible to avoid it. So it certainly doesn't. But I see what you're getting at is maybe why Warren Beatty may not have been available. Yeah, I understand.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, there's a man named Rick Bates did the music for my film, and his brother is the playwright John Robin Bates. And Rick told me that his brother was fascinated with that episode, and thinks he might want to write a play about it
Huh.
because there's there's just a lot of
Potential there.
yeah, a lot of drama, I
Yeah.
think.
But speaking of Woody Allen, you got a really great voiceover actor during that part of the film to do the voiceover for at least a vocal impression.
Of Woody
Yeah,
Allen,
I thought it was pretty good. Who's doing that?
that was me.
What is that right? Had no idea.
Yeah.
And you also have Sarah Jessica Parker, who does some of the voice work for Pauline herself.
Yeah, she voices all of Pauline's writing, and she's not a narrator. She
Yeah,
really is the voice of Pauline. And I spent a lot of time going through Pauline's archives and finding her early letters, and finding some key moments. And so that's how the story is told in the movie. And then I took pieces of interviews that Pauline did later on
hmm,
that were biographical, and so. Yeah, Sarah Jessica did a great job. I knew she would. She's associated with New York like Pauline is, but they're both women who are actually not from New York. And of course, Sarah Jessica had Sex in the City, and every episode of that show starts and ends with the voiceover of her
that's
character as
right.
a writer. So it
Yep.
was a nice connection.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. That's right. Very good. I'll repeat it one more time for posterity. What She Said: The Art of Pauline Kael, directed by Rob Garver. Be at the Film Forum. What a
Yes,
great place for that screening to play. I know that Pauline would have gone there to see it if she were alive. And, it's going to be December 25th. It
25th for
opens.
2 weeks, and
2 weeks.
then we're going
Wonderful.
to be in about 20 other cities in the U.S.
That's amazing. That's terrific. And you'll be on the road, I guess, for a little while.
A little
A
bit.
little
I'm
bit.
not. I don't. I'll go to San Francisco and
Right.
Berkeley,
That makes
which
sense.
is where she's
That makes
from,
sense.
in February.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Where I'm sure some of the folks there would be grateful for the movie coming there and for you to show up, and and that they probably take a lot of ownership of Pauline there. So
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward to
I'm
it.
sure it's going to be great. Thank you very much for coming on the show with the podcast, and I hope we can do this again.
Thank you, Adam. I enjoyed
Me
it.
too. It was a lot of fun to talk about Pauline. It was great. And I'm going to go and finish this article now on Raising Cain.
Yeah.
And look forward to it. You talked it up really well, too.
All right. Well, thanks.
Sure. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.